In December 2008, the Grand Duke of Luxembourg did something almost no constitutional monarch in the modern world had dared to do. He looked at a law his parliament had passed, and he said no. He called it conscience. His government called it a constitutional crisis, and within weeks, that same government rewrote the Constitution so that no Grand Duke, not him, not anyone who came after, could ever say no again. Picture the Grand Ducal Palace in Luxembourg City, December 2008. A man sits before his prime minister. Technically, he is one of the most powerful constitutional monarchs in Western Europe, though almost no one outside Luxembourg could tell you why. There is a law in front of him. Parliament passed it legally. His constitution says his job is to sign it. He does not sign it. That single act of refusal, that quiet, private declaration, would not stop the law. It would not change the vote count. It would not shift public opinion in any permanent way. What it would do was something he perhaps understood in advance and perhaps did not. Trigger a constitutional amendment that removed, forever, the very power that made his refusal meaningful. After December 2008, Grand Duke Henri could still wear the crown. He could stand on the balcony on National Day. He could open Parliament, greet heads of state, deliver the words of national unity that monarchs exist to speak. But one thing had changed permanently. The word assent had been stripped from Article 34 of the Luxembourg Constitution. From that moment forward, the Grand Duke would only promulgate, formally announce, the laws his parliament passed. His signature was still technically required, but it was now, by constitutional definition, automatic. He had no freedom of decision. The law had said so, in the clearest possible language. Here is the question that makes this story worth telling. Why did he do it? Not just, why did a Catholic monarch in an increasingly secular country choose a losing fight over a euthanasia bill? That question has a simple answer, and it is not the interesting one. The interesting question is this. Grand Duke Henri had watched what happened to his uncle, King Baudouin of Belgium, in 1991, when Baudouin faced the same dilemma with Belgium's abortion law. Baudouin found a quiet exit, a legal workaround. He stepped aside for one day, the law passed without him, and he returned to the throne without losing a single constitutional power. That path was available to Henri. His government offered him something similar. He did not take it. Why a man chooses a permanent loss over a temporary one, when both roads lead to the same law being passed, is not a question about politics. It is a question about identity. And that is where this story begins. To understand what Henri gave up in 2008, you first need to understand what he had spent 8 years trying to build. Grand Duke Henri ascended to the throne on the 7th of October, 2000, when his father, Grand Duke Jean, abdicated after 36 years of reign. Jean was beloved, steady, uncontroversial in the way only monarchs who manage to stay entirely out of the news can be. He handed his son a small country, Luxembourg, population 480,000, wedged between Belgium, Germany, and France, and he handed him a title that still carried, on paper, more formal constitutional power than most European monarchies had retained. Henri had been training for this role his entire adult life. He studied political science at the University of Geneva. He completed military officer training at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. He served in Luxembourg's armed forces. By the time he took the oath, he was 45 years old and had spent 2 decades as hereditary Grand Duke, attending ceremonies, learning the terrain, watching his father demonstrate what careful, quiet stewardship of a small monarchy looked like. Beside him throughout all of it was the woman he had married 19 years earlier. Henri had met Maria Theresa Mestre at the University of Geneva in the late 1970s. She was the daughter of a Cuban family of Spanish descent who had fled Havana in 1959 when Fidel Castro's revolution confiscated their properties. They arrived in New York with almost nothing. They rebuilt in exile, first New York, then Geneva. And the Catholic faith they carried was not the kind worn lightly on Sundays. It had been tested. It had survived when the rest of their world had not. Maria Theresa graduated with a degree in political science in 1980. Henri proposed the same year. They married on Valentine's Day, 1981, in the Notre Dame Cathedral of Luxembourg. They had 5 children. He called her his closest advisor. She became a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador and founded humanitarian initiatives on microfinance and human dignity. In public, they presented the image of a couple built on shared faith, shared conviction, and a shared sense of what the crown was for. Luxembourg asked less of its Grand Duke than Britain asked of its king, or Spain of its sovereign. The expectations were modest. Be present, represent the nation, stay out of partisan politics. For the first years of Henri's reign, that arrangement held. He opened Parliament in person in 2004. The first time in over 100 years a Grand Duke had done so, which Luxembourg observers noted not as a celebration, but as an unusual departure from precedent. In 2005, he suggested publicly that he intended to vote in favor of the European Constitution in the national referendum, only to be reminded by senior politicians that he had no such right. These were small missteps, the kind new monarchs make while learning where the invisible walls are. What no one fully anticipated was what would happen when he stopped looking for the walls altogether. To understand the logic of what Henri did, you have to understand what he believed the crown was actually for. Henri was not Catholic in the way that many European monarchs describe themselves as Catholic, the way others might describe themselves as left-handed or born in spring. A biographical fact, inherited, worn without particular weight. Henri's faith was formative in a structural sense, and Maria Theresa's, by most accounts, even more so. She had grown up in a family that lost everything when revolution came. Not abstractly lost, specifically lost. The house, the bank, the country. Her grandfather had founded the Trust Company of Cuba, the most powerful financial institution on the island before Castro came to power. In October 1959, the family left with their children. They arrived in New York and began again. The faith they carried was not a comfort or a tradition. It was the organizing principle that had remained when everything material had been taken. This history mattered to how both Henri and Maria Theresa understood their role. When they married and when he became Grand Duke, they were not two people who separated personal conviction from public function. They were two people who had built their entire lives around the idea that those things were inseparable. When the euthanasia law arrived in 2008, Henri did not process it as a political problem requiring a political solution. He experienced it as a moral problem requiring a moral answer. What he said publicly was restrained, even modest. He told Prime Minister Jean-Claude Juncker that reasons of conscience prevented him from giving his assent. He did not hold press conferences. He did not solicit support from the Vatican. He made a private declaration to his Prime Minister that he could not do this one particular thing. In its form, it was almost quiet. The problem was that the Luxembourg Constitution did not recognize the category of conscience. Article 34 of the Constitution at the time stated that the Grand Duke sanctions and promulgates laws. It did not say, unless he has a moral objection. It did not contain a conscience clause. It did not provide a mechanism for a head of state who disagreed with a legally passed law. It simply said, the Grand Duke signs. There was one prior case in Luxembourg's history. In 1912, Grand Duchess Marie Adelaide had refused to sign legislation that would limit the role of Catholic priests in primary education. She had religion. She had precedent. She had conviction. She also had, within 7 years, lost the throne. Her refusal had fed a crisis that accumulated through World War I until 1919, when she abdicated in favor of her younger sister, Charlotte. Henri knew this history. He held a degree in political science. He had been groomed for the crown since the age of 9. He said no anyway. Luxembourg began to ask the question it would not stop asking for years afterward. Who, exactly, had decided this was the moment to make that stand? Was it the judgment of one man, acting alone? Or had the decision traveled through a marriage before it arrived at a prime minister's desk? Prime Minister Jean-Claude Juncker received Henri's declaration on the 2nd of December, 2008. Juncker was not a man easily caught off balance by political complexity. He had been Luxembourg's prime minister since 1995. He would later become president of the European Commission. He was experienced, measured, and by all public accounts, genuinely fond of Henri personally. He also understood, with some precision, exactly what Henri had just done to himself. Juncker did not respond with anger. He responded with speed. Within days, he appeared before the cameras and laid out the government's plan. The word sanction, the constitutional word that gave the Grand Duke any standing to refuse, would be removed from Article 34 of the Luxembourg Constitution. The Grand Duke would still promulgate laws. His signature would still be required. But the meaning of that signature would be fundamentally altered. It would be administrative, not deliberative. A notification, not a judgment. The message was surgical and it was complete. You can keep the crown. You cannot keep the conscience that comes attached to the crown. What made the response extraordinary was not just its speed, but its finality. Juncker was not simply resolving the crisis in front of him. He was closing the door on all future versions of the same crisis. No future Grand Duke, not Henri's son Guillaume, not Guillaume's children, not anyone who came after, would ever again have the constitutional standing to say, "I cannot sign this because of what I believe." That option had existed, unused and largely forgotten, inside the Luxembourg Constitution for its entire modern history. Now it would be gone. The vote in the Chamber of Deputies was 56-0, one abstention. Henri himself had agreed to the amendment. In a meaningful sense, he had proposed it. He had understood that the only way to remain Grand Duke while refusing to assent to the law was to accept the permanent removal of the power that made refusal meaningful. He chose the throne over the power. He chose the symbol over the substance. And here the story becomes genuinely strange, because Henri was not a man who had stumbled into constitutional monarchy without understanding its rules. He had watched his father govern for 36 years. He had advisors, legal counsel, the full machinery of the Grand Ducal Court. He had the example, the very recent and directly relevant example, of his uncle, King Baudouin of Belgium, who in 1991 had faced the identical dilemma over Belgium's abortion law and had found a solution that cost him nothing permanent. The Belgian path was technically available in Luxembourg. Declare the Grand Duke temporarily unable to perform his duties. The Council of Ministers signs the law. The Grand Duke is restored the following day. The law stands. No constitutional amendment. No permanent reduction of powers. Henri's government was aware of this option. Henri was aware of this option. He did not take it. Several analysts who covered the crisis observed that Henri's choice to refuse outright, rather than accept a quiet workaround, pointed to something operating below the level of political calculation. Michel Pauli, a professor of Luxembourg history at the University of Luxembourg, suggested at the time that Henri was working from a place of genuine conviction. The difficulty, Pauli noted, was that Henri had never fully accumulated the popular legitimacy that might have allowed him to weather that conviction without structural consequence. His father, Jean, had reigned for 36 years and built an enormous reservoir of public goodwill. Henri had been Grand Duke for 8. The reservoir was far shallower than he perhaps believed. A poll taken on the 3rd and 4th of December, the 2 days following his announcement, showed that 60% of Luxembourgers disapproved of his refusal. 69% wanted the Grand Duke to become a purely ceremonial monarch. 70% supported the euthanasia law. Those numbers describe a man who had miscalculated, with some severity, how many of his citizens shared his moral framework. Threaded through all of it, never confirmed, never cleanly dismissed, was the question Luxembourg's court observers had been circling for years before the crisis, and would not stop circling after. How much of what Henri said and did reflected Henri alone? And how much had passed through the woman who had stood beside him at the Notre Dame Cathedral on Valentine's Day, 1981, and had never left his side since? The timeline of what followed was swift, almost clinical in its precision. 2nd of December, 2008. Henri tells Juncker he will not assent to the euthanasia law. 3rd of December. Juncker holds a press conference. The constitutional amendment is announced. The word sanction will be removed from Article 34. The Grand Duke will henceforth only promulgate. 18th of February, 2009. The Chamber of Deputies approved the euthanasia law in its second and final reading. 30 votes in favor, 26 against. The same day, the Chamber votes 56-0 to amend the Constitution. The amendment takes effect immediately. Henri promulgates the euthanasia law. His signature appears at the bottom of the document. The law, he had said, in so many words, that he could not sign, he signs. Not as sanction, not as approval, as announcement. The Constitution now said those were legally distinct acts. Everyone in the room understood they were performed by the same hand. What Henri had lost was not symbolic. It was structural. Before December 2008, the Grand Duke of Luxembourg held a constitutional veto over legislation. It had almost never been used in the modern era. The only prior example dated back to 1912. But it had existed, dormant inside the Constitution since Luxembourg's modern constitutional order was established. It meant there was, at least in theory, a category of law the Grand Duke could decline to enact, not indefinitely, not without consequence, but with legal standing. He had a right to say no, and the right was real. After February 2009, that right was gone. Not suspended, not narrowed, removed. Henri had agreed to its removal. The statement Justice Minister Luc Frieden delivered following the vote was chosen with care. He said the amendment allowed Henri to continue his reign while respecting the rules of democracy. The language was diplomatic. It also contained a blade. The implication that refusing to sign a democratically passed law had not respected those rules. That Henri had been, however briefly, operating on the wrong side of democracy's logic. It is worth pausing on what Luxembourg was actually deciding in those weeks, not just about Henri, but about the structure of constitutional monarchy itself. The question at the center of the crisis was not about euthanasia. Euthanasia was the occasion. The constitutional question was different and older. Does a head of state in a parliamentary monarchy retain any personal moral agency? Or is the surrender of moral agency precisely what the crown requires? Baudouin's approach in 1991 had implicitly answered, you may preserve your moral agency, briefly, technically, if you are willing to perform a legal fiction. Step aside for one day, let the cabinet act, return to the throne. Your conscience is recorded. It is not consequential. Henri had not wanted the legal fiction. He wanted to say no in his own name as Grand Duke, as a man with beliefs. He wanted his constitutional act, his signature, to be an expression of his personal conviction, not a purely administrative function. Luxembourg's parliament had answered, in this role, in this constitution, in this country. This constitution, in this country, the combination you are describing, Grand Duke and conscience, simultaneously, publicly, with legal force, is no longer available to you. It is here that the question of Maria Theresa's influence becomes more than court gossip. Because Henri's choice, direct refusal over workaround, was not the obvious political move. It was not even the obvious Catholic move. Baudouin was as devout a Catholic as any European monarch of the 20th century. He had found his workaround without violating his conscience, because he understood the distinction between personal conviction and constitutional function. He had been willing to perform the legal fiction. His conviction was preserved. His power was preserved. The law passed, the system survived intact. Henri, by contrast, had refused the fiction. He had insisted that the two things, personal conviction and constitutional act, be one and the same thing, publicly, permanently. He had made his conscience visible in a place where the Constitution had no category for it. The question Luxembourg asked, and which it never fully resolved, was whether that insistence was Henri's own. Maria Theresa had no formal role in Luxembourg's constitutional order. Her influence, whatever it was and however it moved, could not be voted on, amended away, or made to appear in the Chamber of Deputies debate records. She had not refused to sign anything. The Constitution had not been changed to account for her. And that is precisely what made her position, in some readings of the crisis, the most structurally durable power in the entire story. The Parliament could rewrite Article 34. It could not rewrite what happens between two people in the same house, shaped by the same faith, sharing the same understanding of what duty means. What can be confirmed, Henri made the announcement. Henri cited conscience. Henri consented to the amendment. Henri remained Grand Duke for another 17 years, until his abdication in 2025. What remains unconfirmed and unaddressed directly by either Henri or Maria Theresa, whether the decision to refuse outright, rather than accept the available exit, was made by one person or two. The euthanasia law took effect. Luxembourg became one of a small number of countries in the world where terminally ill patients had a legal right to determine the timing of their own death. The legislation stood. The constitutional drama that had surrounded it was resolved. From the outside, very little had visibly changed. But what the crisis had exposed, and what Luxembourg's political culture would spend years quietly processing, was a question that extended well beyond Henri, beyond Luxembourg, and well beyond the specific politics of end-of-life legislation. The question is this: what is a constitutional monarch actually for? The standard answer is symbol, continuity, national unity held above the fray of partisan debate. The crown exists to represent something that outlasts any single government, any single parliamentary majority. The monarch stands above the daily argument. But Henri had demonstrated in 2008 the fault line running through that answer. A human being cannot be only a symbol. A human being carries a conscience, a faith, a marriage, a history of everything he has been told is right. And at some point, that human content will collide with what the symbol is being asked to perform. Baudouin had found a way to keep those things separated, barely, technically, for one day. Henri had decided he could not make that separation, or had decided he should not. The difference between those two is not small, and the system's response had been precise. Then we will remove the mechanism by which your conscience can become legally consequential. We are not asking you to agree with the law. We are not asking you to change your faith, your marriage, or your understanding of right and wrong. We are asking you to understand that in this role, your conscience has no constitutional standing. It never truly did. We are simply making the document reflect what was always true. What was lost in the resolution of the crisis was not Henri's faith, not his title, not his place on the throne. What was lost was a fiction, maintained for decades across most European constitutional monarchies, that the monarch's role still contains some residual authority, that there exists some final extreme at which the crown can refuse, that the person inside the role still has some small space to be a person. After February 2009, Luxembourg had answered that question with unusual directness. No, there is no such extreme. Not in this country. Not anymore. Michel Pauli called the change the natural democratic evolution of the constitutional monarchy. And he was likely correct. Denmark, Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands. Most modern constitutional monarchies had already arrived at the same practical position, or were approaching it through convention and custom, generation by generation. The monarch signs. The monarch is not consulted about agreement. What made Luxembourg unusual was not where it arrived, but how it got there. Not gradually, not through quiet norm building over decades, but suddenly, in response to one man's refusal over 3 months by a parliamentary vote of 56-0. Henri had not intended to accelerate his country's constitutional evolution. He had intended, it seems, to be a man who stood for something. Luxembourg's parliament had told him, with great precision and almost no visible anger, that standing for something was not written into the job description. Grand Duke Henri abdicated on the 7th of October, 2025, exactly 25 years after the day he had taken the constitutional oath. His son, Guillaume, became Grand Duke. The ceremony carried the words these occasions always carry: service, continuity, the weight of history received and passed forward. Henri was 70 years old. He had reigned for a quarter of a century. In most ways an outside observer could measure, his reign had been quiet. Luxembourg remained stable, wealthy, and geographically unchanged. The monarchy continued. The institution survived him, as institutions tend to do. But there is a kind of institution that survives for a long time by outlasting the people who challenge it. And Henri had been, in a strange sense, one of those challengers. Not from outside the institution, but from its center. On a Tuesday morning in December 2008, when he told his prime minister that he had a conscience, and his conscience said no. What he had proven, what Luxembourg's swift and nearly bloodless response had made permanent, was that constitutional monarchies are not designed to accommodate that sentence. They are not built around the moral weight of the individual who wears the crown. They are built around the crown itself, which is the opposite thing: a role, a function, a legal position that exists independently of the human being placed inside it. There is something both clarifying and quietly devastating about the outcome. The Parliament had not needed to remove Henri. It did not humiliate him. It did not call for his abdication. It simply made explicit what had always, technically, been true. The signature was never truly his to withhold. The word assent had suggested otherwise. For decades, it had sat in the Luxembourg Constitution, implying there was a moment of genuine agreement in the Grand Duke's act of signing, a moment in which his judgment was present and real and mattered. After 2008, the word was gone. The moment it referred to was gone with it. Henri continued to sign laws for 17 more years, hundreds of them, across every domain of Luxembourg public life. His signature appeared on tax legislation, infrastructure bills, social programs, family law, environmental regulations. No one asked whether he agreed. No one needed to. The Constitution was clear. He had wanted to be a man who stood for something. He ended up being, in the legal language of his own country, a man who announces. Whether that distinction between standing for something and announcing something is the tragedy of Henri's reign, or simply the honest description of what constitutional monarchy has always been and has always required, is a question Luxembourg has never fully settled. Some things a monarchy survives by leaving unanswered. If this story made you think about what we ask of the people we place above us, about the cost of conviction and the invisible walls inside power, leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're new to this channel, subscribe. History keeps more of these stories than it lets on.